At my retirement party, my wife handed me divorce papers saying, "I don't want to take care of an old retiree," while my kids nodded in agreement. I smiled and disappeared in the most devastating way possible. The manila envelope felt heavy in my hands as I stared at the divorce papers. Irreconcilable differences, division of assets, alimony. Laura leaned in close, her voice cold as Chicago winter. "Richard, you understand, don't you? I don't want to take care of an old retiree." I looked up from the papers to see a man I didn't recognize standing near our back gate, watching the scene with a smug smile. My eyes turned to Brian and Melissa, my children. They weren't surprised. They were exchanging glances like they were sharing a secret. "You knew?" was all I could say. Brian shrugged. "Dad, you have to understand our position. Mom deserves to be happy, and we need to think about the future too." Melissa nodded eagerly. "Your investments, the company stocks, all of this. It's a lot to manage. Maybe it's better to leave it in the hands of those who understand it better." In that moment, everything crystallized. This wasn't about Laura's happiness. This was about money, my money. They thought that at 62, I'd be easy prey, the old retiree who would sign any paper, divide everything without question, maybe even die conveniently in a few years. But they didn't know Richard Hale, the CFO. They only knew Richard Hale, the devoted husband and father. I folded the papers calmly and put them in my pocket. "All right," I said simply. "I'll sign. Let me explain how I got here financially, because the numbers are crucial to understanding what happened next. For nearly 30 years, I was the chief financial officer at Midwest Industries, one of Chicago's largest manufacturing companies. My annual salary was $285,000, plus bonuses that typically added another $75,000, $95,000 yearly. But salary was just the beginning. I owned our $640,000 house in Winnetka outright, purchased strategically before marriage to keep it as separate property. I had $1.2 million in company stock, $890,000 in various retirement accounts, and $430,000 in personal investments that Laura knew about. What she didn't know about was the other $2.8 million I'd accumulated over the past 5 years. Following my always cautious CFO instincts, I'd substantially diversified my investments through offshore accounts, investment funds under different names, and stakes in companies they never dreamed existed. Every bonus I'd received, every salary increase, everything went first to my family. When Brian wanted his MBA at Northwestern, I paid the $47,000 tuition without hesitation. When Melissa decided to open her boutique in Lincoln Park, I financed the initial $100,000. For Laura, there was no limit. Trips to Europe, a new Lexus every year, designer clothes and jewelry. My mistake was thinking devotion would be reciprocated. The party continued around us, but I was mentally absent, watching Laura laugh with the stranger near our gate. I saw my children whispering among themselves, probably dividing my fortune before I'd even signed the papers. 3 days later, I signed the divorce papers at my attorney's office. I divided the visible assets exactly as Illinois law required. Laura got the house, half of our joint accounts totaling $340,000, and standard alimony of $3,200 monthly based on my declared income. The children received company stocks worth $180,000 each, and access to a fund I'd created years earlier. They thought they'd won the lottery. They had no idea they'd just lost the game. What I gave them were precisely the investments I knew were about to crater. Midwest Industries stock, for example. I knew the company was facing competitiveness problems that would become public only months after my divorce. The stock would lose 68% of its value in the first year. The other investments I left for division were equally problematic. High-risk funds that looked solid on surface analysis, but which I knew were artificially inflated. The day after signing the papers, I did something no one expected. I disappeared. Not literally, but to Laura, Brian, and Melissa, it was as if I'd evaporated. I canceled my phone, closed all social media accounts, and moved to a small cabin I'd purchased months earlier in rural Oregon near Bend. A 10-acre property in the middle of nowhere, with no neighbors and no questions. They tried contacting me immediately through my old phone number, which I'd kept active for exactly 1 week to monitor their desperation. Desperate messages from Laura. "Richard, we need to talk about the alimony details." Brian left voicemails. Dad, where are you? We have questions about the company funds. Melissa was more direct. Daddy, this is ridiculous. You can't just disappear. After that week, I canceled the service completely, but I could disappear, and I did exactly that. While they searched for Richard Hale, the wounded and betrayed man, I was transforming into something completely different. My experience as a CFO hadn't disappeared with the divorce. For the first time in decades, I could apply it entirely for my own benefit. I set up a professional home office in the cabin, 3 monitors, satellite fiber connection, and all the tools a serious investor needed. I started strategically, day trading, emerging market analysis, investments in tech startups. My advantage was obvious: 30 years of reading balance sheets, identifying solid companies, and separating genuine opportunities from financial garbage. In 6 months, I'd doubled my initial capital of $2.8 million. In 1 year, I'd tripled it. Cryptocurrencies were just beginning their major run, and my conservative analysis kept me away from the scam coins that destroyed amateur investors while building solid positions in blockchain companies with real fundamentals. I consulted with David Chen, a private wealth manager in Portland who specialized in high-net-worth individuals seeking discretion. Mr. Hale, he told me during our first meeting, with your background and starting capital, we can structure investments that will generate substantial passive income within 18 months. David was right. 2 of the startups I'd invested in were acquired by Silicon Valley giants for 40x returns. My diversified stock portfolio was generating monthly dividends that exceeded my old CFO's salary. I bought commercial properties in Oregon's growing tech corridor, stakes in private equity funds, and even a small aircraft leasing company. But money was only part of the equation. The real project was Richard Hale 2.0. I began taking care of my health seriously. Gym every morning, hikes on Oregon trails, balanced nutrition. At 63, I was in better shape than I'd been at 50. I let my beard grow, bought clothes that actually pleased me instead of corporate suits I'd worn for decades. I learned to play guitar, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. It was on one of my morning walks in downtown Bend that I met Clara. She ran a small bookstore called Chapter and Verse. A 52-year-old woman with natural gray hair and eyes that genuinely lit up when she smiled. Also divorced, childless by choice, but with a passion for life I hadn't seen in years. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours. Books, travel, dreams we'd abandoned along the way. You have interesting energy, she told me on our 3rd date. You seem like someone who went through something difficult but came out stronger. She wasn't wrong. Clara and I married at a small courthouse in Bend after 8 months of dating. Nothing extravagant, just us, 2 witnesses, and the certainty we'd found something real. 6 months later, we adopted Lily, an 8-year-old girl whose biological parents had lost custody due to neglect. Watching Clara care for Lily, seeing pure love in that child's eyes, showed me what I'd lost in Chicago, but also what I'd gained by losing it. Meanwhile, my investments continued growing exponentially. Within 3 years, my net worth had reached $12.8 million, larger than it had ever been during my entire marriage to Laura. But most importantly, I was genuinely happy. Lily called me daddy without hesitation. Clara looked at me every morning like I was the best part of her day. We'd built a simple but rich life: family dinners, weekend trips to the mountains, evenings playing Scrabble while Lily did homework at our kitchen table. It was in the 4th year of my new life that the first desperate contact arrived. My lawyer in Chicago, Dr. Peterson, called with an update I'd been expecting. They'd found him through public records since he'd handled my divorce proceedings. Richard, your ex-wife is trying to locate you through my office. She wants to renegotiate the alimony terms. Apparently, she's facing serious financial difficulties. Financial difficulties? I asked, genuinely amused. How interesting. And my children? They have also made contact. Brian mentions problems with his business investments. Melissa's boutique closed last year. She's asking for financial advice. I smiled for the first time in 4 years, thinking about my former family. Dr. Peterson, please inform them that Richard Hale does not wish to be contacted. If they persist, you have authorization to take appropriate legal measures to ensure my privacy. Understood. But Richard, they seem genuinely desperate. I know. I replied calmly. That's exactly how I planned it. What happened next was a symphony of consequences that I observed from a distance, like a conductor watching his most complex composition performed perfectly. Dr. Peterson became my source of information about my former family's systematic collapse. The updates arrived like clockwork every few months, each one more satisfying than the last. Richard, I need to update you on the situation in Chicago. Your ex-wife Laura is in serious trouble. That man at your retirement party, Marcus, revealed his true nature a few months after your disappearance. Marcus wasn't the successful businessman he'd pretended to be. He was a professional con artist who'd identified Laura as an easy mark, a newly divorced woman with access to substantial money. He'd convinced her to invest in his fictitious import company, $200,000 from her asset division, plus $50,000 she'd taken from an emergency fund I'd left. When Marcus disappeared with the money, Laura discovered the company didn't even legally exist. The documents were forged, the office was rented month to month, and Marcus Johnson wasn't even his real name. She's living in a one-bedroom apartment in Cicero now, Peterson continued. Lost the Winnetka house, couldn't maintain the mortgage payments without supplementary income. The alimony was another aspect of my careful planning. When I'd signed the divorce papers, my official income was only my base salary from Midwest Industries. All my substantial investments were structured through holdings and trusts that weren't considered regular income. This meant alimony was calculated on a much smaller base than Laura expected. She'd planned to live comfortably on the $3,200 monthly I was required to pay, plus returns from investments she'd received in the divorce. But those investments were precisely the ones I knew were about to depreciate catastrophically. And my children, I asked, already knowing the answer would be equally satisfying. Brian invested heavily in a cryptocurrency startup that promised to revolutionize digital payments. He put in almost everything, money from the asset division, a loan against his house, even his children's college fund. The company was a Ponzi scheme. He lost $420,000 total. Brian had always been impulsive, even as a child. He wanted fast results, obvious shortcuts. I'd tried teaching him about patience and careful analysis, but he'd always preferred trusting his gut over sound financial education. Now that gut instinct had cost his family's entire future. Melissa expanded the boutique too quickly, opened 2 additional stores without sufficient capital to sustain growth. When the pandemic hit, she was paying rent for 3 premium Lincoln Park locations without enough revenue to cover costs. She's in debt for approximately $190,000. Melissa had always wanted everything expensive and glamorous. I'd financed her first boutique precisely because I knew she didn't have the temperament to build a sustainable business. She saw only the excitement of being an entrepreneur, never the brutal numbers that determine success or failure in retail. They're looking for you more urgently now, Peterson continued. Laura called my office 17 times last week. Brian sent a 3-page letter explaining his situation and begging for just one conversation. Melissa is offering apologies and promising she'll never again be part of any conspiracy against you. Conspiracy. What an interesting word choice. They were finally admitting the retirement party had been a calculated setup. Richard, they're really desperate. Laura mentions considering personal bankruptcy. Brian might lose his house. Melissa is living with her mother in that Cicero apartment. I heard all this while sitting in my home office in Oregon. Not the original cabin, but the 600-acre ranch I'd purchased the previous year with panoramic views of the Cascade Mountains. Through my window, I could see Clara and Lily playing in our yard. Lily was teaching Clara to ride horses in our small stable. Their laughter echoed through the valley. Dr. Peterson, I finally said, they can keep trying to contact me, but my position remains unchanged. Richard Hale does not wish communication with these people. I understand, but what if they try to locate you physically? Laura mentioned hiring a private investigator. I smiled. They're welcome to try, but they'll discover that Richard Hale from Chicago no longer exists in public records. The man they're looking for disappeared 5 years ago. It was true. I'd officially changed my residence to Oregon, reorganized all my businesses through complex corporate structures, and even altered details of my civil registry, not illegally, but taking advantage of American legal system complexities I knew intimately after 3 decades as a CFO. 5 years after my retirement party, I decided to send a final message to close this chapter forever. Clara was making pancakes in our kitchen, while Lily practiced piano in our living room. Chopin, one of the pieces she was learning for her school recital. I was watching this perfect domestic scene when Dr. Peterson called with another update. Richard, Laura is in the hospital. She had a severe anxiety attack and is being treated for depression and extreme financial stress. Brian called my office crying, literally crying, asking for just 5 minutes of conversation. He says he needs guidance to save his family from complete bankruptcy. I looked toward my own family. Clara smiled at me from the kitchen. Lily waved from the music room. 5 years ago, I was a man who dedicated his entire life to people who saw me as a walking ATM. Today I was a father, husband, and mentor to people who loved me for who I was. Dr. Peterson, I want you to send a letter to each of them. The same letter. Can I dictate now? Of course. I took a deep breath. Dear Laura, Brian, and Melissa, the man you discarded 5 years ago no longer exists. What remains has not forgotten. You judge me as a worthless old retiree. You have now discovered how much that miscalculation cost. There will be no second chance, no reconciliation, no financial rescue. You made your choices based on greed and convenience. Now live with the consequences. Sincerely, Richard Hale. That's it? Peterson asked, surprised. No. Include a photo. That afternoon, Clara, Lily, and I posed for a professional photograph in front of our house. The stone and wood mansion with mountain views, stables in the background, my Tesla Model S in the circular driveway, and the small plane I'd bought for weekend trips to Seattle. In the photo, I wore jeans and a flannel shirt, clothes I would never have considered in Chicago. Clara was radiant in a simple summer dress. Lily held Duke, our golden retriever we'd adopted the previous year. We were all genuinely smiling. On the back, I wrote by hand. The Hale Family, Oregon, 2024. Built on love, not money. 3 weeks later, Peterson called with the results. Richard, your letter caused quite an impact. Laura tried calling my office 46 times the first day. Brian sent a 12-page response that reads more like a confession than a letter. Melissa showed up personally at my Chicago office. What did she say? That you had won, that they finally understood it was never about money for you, but about respect and loyalty. She wanted me to convey that they're proud of the man you've become, but they know it's too late. Proud. What fascinating irony. She asked if you were really happy. When I showed her the photo, she was silent for almost 5 minutes. Then she said, "He looks 20 years younger. I never saw him smile like that when he lived with us." Peterson paused. Richard, may I ask a personal question? Do you feel any satisfaction from their suffering? I considered the question carefully. Satisfaction? No. Relief? Absolutely. For 5 years I carried anger and betrayal like a stone in my chest. Today that stone has disappeared, not because they're suffering, but because I built something better. It was true. Watching their collapse didn't bring me joy. It brought closure, proof that I had made the right decision to disappear, rebuild, and choose genuine love over toxic obligation. 6 months later, I received a final update from Peterson. Laura had moved to a government-subsidized assisted living facility in a Chicago suburb. Brian got a job as an accountant at a small company in Rockford, slowly rebuilding but never recovering his previous standard of living. Melissa went back to college at 42, studying to become an elementary school teacher. They survived. That was all I wanted to know. Today, 2 years after sending that letter, I wake up every morning in a house full of laughter and genuine love. Lily, now 15, is applying to universities with a full merit scholarship she earned herself, because Clara and I taught her that real achievements come from effort, not inheritance. Clara expanded her bookstore to 3 Oregon cities and is writing her first novel. At 67, I'm happier than I ever imagined possible. My net worth now exceeds $18 million, but it serves a different purpose. Not to support people who see me as a means to an end, but to build a real legacy with people who love me for who I am. Sometimes Clara asks if I miss my previous life. I always answer the same way. You can't miss something you never really had. The betrayal by Laura, Brian, and Melissa wasn't just the end of relationships, it was the birth of the real Richard Hale, a man who learned that the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemies, but building a life so fulfilling that they become completely irrelevant. They taught me that love cannot be bought, but it can be lost. That family is not a right, but a privilege, and that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't anger, but the indifference that comes from a genuinely well-lived life. The lesson here is simple. Document everything, protect your assets strategically, and never let people mistake kindness for weakness. When someone shows you their true priorities, believe them the first time, and plan accordingly. If you enjoyed this story of strategic revenge and financial justice, make sure to subscribe for more tales of people who refuse to be taken advantage of. Hit that notification bell because karma always comes collecting, and you won't want to miss how it all unfolds.